Okay, we can go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us tonight to help us launch our new research center, the Western Restorative Justice and Reentry Center. My name is Dr. Taryn Vanderpyle. I am the research director of the center and the editor-in-chief of our new journal. This center is a passion project for me, as it is for all of us involved. Seeing it come to fruition is incredibly rewarding, and we are thrilled to be part of the work that will continue to come out of this center. In addition to my work at the center, I am the Assistant Professor of Criminal Justice Sciences at Western Oregon University. My research focuses on interventions within and legislation concerning juvenile and adult corrections that affect reentry and recidivism, as well as addressing the social hostility toward those with justice system involvement. It is essential to me to prioritize the voice of those with lived experience in the criminal and juvenile justice systems, and to learn directly from them how to address reform. My earlier experience as a high school special education teacher and consultant, as well as a foster parent, have contributed to my research and activism regarding disproportionate representations of vulnerable and marginalized populations in the criminal and juvenile justice systems. These experiences are the foundations for everything I do now. My work on affecting the outcomes of youth and adults in these systems has led to participation in several academic, behavioral, and reintegration programs in both juvenile and adult corrections facilities, with a priority on emphasizing the voices of those seldom heard. I presented on behalf of my research participants and fellow change agents at multiple national and regional criminal justice conferences and published in peer-reviewed journal articles across various related fields of study. It is an honor to get to continue this work under the umbrella of WRJRC. So I would like you now to meet all the others involved with the center.
Hello, I'm Hilary Fouts, Dean of Graduate Studies and Research here at Western Oregon University. I'm thrilled to welcome you to this launch event of the Western Restorative Justice and Reentry Center. Part of my role here is to oversee research centers on our campus. I'm so excited about our newest center, the WRJRC. As I'm sure you will learn this evening, the work of the center is incredibly important and particularly timely in our society and region. There are so many potential positive impacts of the center, and I'm particularly excited about the amazing educational and research opportunities that the center will provide for WU's undergraduate and graduate students. Thank you so much for attending this event and showing your support to WU's newest research center.
Welcome to the launch event of the Western Restorative Justice and Reentry Center, Western's newest center on our campus. We are happy to have you here. I am Dr. Vivian Jokoto. I am the center director. And we are here today along with my colleagues, Dr. Taryn Vanderpyle, who is the research director, Dr. Omar Melchor Ayala, who is research coordinator, Dr. Miyuki Arimoto, research coordinator, and Dr. Mari Sakiyama, research coordinator. They'll all introduce themselves shortly, and you'll get to know a little more about what we all do here. Our center exists to conduct research on restorative justice and reentry. And if you ask why restorative justice and reentry, you look at the criminal justice system, and we all recognize that we have very high rates of recidivism. So when people are incarcerated, they come out and then they go back in because of a number of reasons. So our center, when you look at what restorative justice does, restorative justice tries to find alternatives to incarceration. So we recognize that there are times when incarceration may not be the answer to a crime, and therefore we research ways that restorative justice can be used to solve crime problems without the use of incarceration. We also recognize that there are times when incarceration is the answer and there's no way around it. And in those cases, we want to conduct research to support efforts of being able to help people reintegrate when they leave prison and come back into society. So that's what Reentry focuses on. So we exist to work with basically all aspects of the criminal justice system, and there's something we can do for practically everybody research-wise. So check us out, look at our website, and you'll find out more about what we do. Browse around and you'll find out about our activities, events, research, grants, and everything we have ongoing. We look forward to being able to be a place for students to be able to partner up and conduct research with faculty in the Criminal Justice Sciences Division. So we are very happy to provide that opportunity to our students, and we are very happy to also be a place that agencies can come to for their research needs. So welcome. We look forward to having you over at this center. And in case you think of ways that you would need us, please feel free to reach out. I'd like tonight to recognize Dr. Karuna Thompson, who is here to speak to us about restorative justice and reentry. And I'd like to say a thank you to Dr. Taryn Vanderpyle for running this whole program this evening. So welcome, and we are very happy to have you here.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this launch event. My name is Miyuki Arimoto, one of the faculty member of the Criminal Justice Sciences, and also a research coordinator of the Western Restorative Justice and Reentry Center. My research areas are juvenile justice and corrections, especially from restorative justice and transformative justice perspectives. I have done my research at OSP about the impact of the healing garden, which is still ongoing. Meanwhile, I just started my new research on reentry initiatives in the Midwest. When it comes to juveniles, my lifelong research topic is teen court. I am so excited to be a part of this center. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Enjoy.
Hi everyone, welcome. My name is Omar Melchor Ayala, and I'm one of the faculty in the Criminal Justice Sciences Division. I'm also the practicum coordinator for the Criminal Justice Department, and I am the research coordinator for the area of juvenile justice under the Western Restorative Justice and Reentry Center. I want to welcome you to this launch event. My interest in research revolve around the areas of juvenile justice, of course, but also restorative justice and the overall intersection between immigration and crime, specifically issues that relate to immigrants within the criminal justice system. I want to thank you all for joining today, and I hope that you enjoy the event.
Hello, my name is Mari Sakiyama. I'm an assistant professor at Western Oregon University. I'm a Japanese native and received my doctorate degree in public affairs from University of Nevada, Las Vegas, or UNLV. I will be serving as the Western Restorative Justice and Reentry Center's research coordinator for law enforcement and policing related research, and also an editor for the affiliated journal of Restoration, Rehabilitation, and Reentry. At UNLV, I was very fortunate and I had an opportunity to gain a rich research experience throughout the various fields in criminal justice, including the police, courts, and correction. My original research interest was heavily involved in juvenile justice and restorative justice, which I love, but I have shifted my research focus more geared toward the police and community relations and comparative criminology recently. Within policing-related research, I conduct survey research to measure and understand public members' perception for the police or law enforcement personnel and their attitudes toward their workplace. I'm truly excited to be a part of the center and looking forward to collaborate with various public and private sectors and assist them with their needs by offering empirical evidence to their operational practices. Thank you.
As you can see, we have a great team managing the day-to-day work of the center. We also are guided by an impressive advisory board. Let me tell you a little bit about each of our advisory board members now. Dr. Ian Martyr is lecturer in criminology at Maynooth University. He holds a PhD in restorative policing from the University of Leeds. He has worked with the University of Liverpool as a research associate and for the Council of Europe as a scientific expert, drafting its new recommendation concerning restorative justice in criminal matters. Since 2019, Ian has coordinated Restorative Justice Strategies for Change. This is a 10-country European project seeking to work with governments, criminal justice agencies, and civil society to implement their new recommendation. We also have Dr. Tom O'Connor, who is internationally recognized for his communication, facilitation, and cultural change skills. His companies, Transforming Corrections and Transforming Communication, use dialogue to guide agencies in the co-creation of new cultural contexts to advance their implementation of evidence-based practices and achieve better client, staff, and community outcomes. He has degrees in law, philosophy, theology, counseling, and religion. He spent 9 years living as a friar, which is a wandering monk, with the Catholic religious order called the Carmelites. When he was the administrator of religious services for the Oregon Department of Corrections, Tom led a team of 24 chaplains and over 2,000 volunteers to co-create the Oregon model of humanistic, spiritual, and religious prison chaplaincy. Published research has shown that the model reduced recidivism. The model was featured on National Public Radio and in an award-winning film by Martin Doblmeier called Chaplains. We also have Arnaldo Ruiz, who works at the Latino Network for the Youth Empowerment and Violence Prevention Division as a program manager. He oversees 3 culturally specific mentoring programs that provide mentoring services for youth who've been impacted by the criminal justice system. Arnaldo was formerly incarcerated within the Oregon Department of Corrections for 19 years, and he uses his lived experience within the criminal justice system to help youth from the perspective of a credible messenger. Karuna is going to tell us a little bit more about Arnaldo's work a little bit later on. Scott Smith is Restorative Justice Program Manager at the Center for Dialogue and Resolution in Oregon, in Eugene, Oregon. In this capacity, he oversees the Restorative Division program for the Lane County Circuit Court, as well as providing training and coaching for educators seeking to integrate restorative justice principles into their schools. CDR's restorative justice programming has also extended recently into partnerships with the University of Oregon Office of Student Conduct and Lane County Parole and Probation. Scott currently sits on the coordinating committees of the Northwest Justice Forum and the Restorative Justice Coalition of Oregon. He has worked in the US and abroad in education and conflict transformation and tends to approach these 2 disciplines as different aspects of the same overall project. I will skip Karuna's introduction for now and come back to that later. So let's move on to Trevor Walraven. He's the Director of Public Education and Outreach for the Youth Justice Project at the Oregon Justice Resource Center. Trevor is a formerly incarcerated youth offender who served almost 18 years in correctional facilities starting at age 14. In February of 2016, Trevor successfully proved outstanding rehabilitation and reformation under Oregon's Second Look statute. He was the second juvenile lifer to be released under Second Look. Since his release, Trevor has spoken at many of Oregon's institutions, including universities, correctional facilities, and advocacy organizations about growing up in Oregon's criminal justice system. So the purpose of this center is to promote research in the field of non-punitive approaches to solving problems by providing a space for like-minded scholars in these specific areas: restorative justice, correctional rehabilitation, post-incarceration reentry, and overall decreasing recidivism. Our mission is to connect scholars with each other and with those agencies and practitioners whose work can be supported by researching findings coming out of this center. The goal is to broaden the knowledge base in the criminal justice field through research in those areas that I listed. We want to expand the impact and the influence of research with an emphasis on public criminology. And we want to serve as a resource on best practices in restoration and criminal justice reform for all parties interested in this line of work. We also want to improve the educational experiences of students and the community by providing opportunities for collaborative research. And finally, we want to promote research to fill that existing gap in the literature in the areas of interest that we have listed. One of the ways in which we want to accomplish this mission is through this new journal, our Journal of Restoration, Rehabilitation, and Reentry, that we commonly refer to as R3 or R cubed because that's a long name. This is a refereed interdisciplinary journal committed to exploring reformation and healing. I hope those of you doing research in the areas we are discussing tonight will consider submitting your work to our journal for publication. We would be honored. As we continue this evening, please feel free to use the chat feature, as some of you have done already. Thank you for that. And post any questions you may have in the Q&A at the bottom of your screens. We look forward to a rich discussion after Dr. Thompson's presentation. And speaking of Dr. Thompson, now for our main event of the evening, far more important than listening to me, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce to you tonight my friend and colleague, Dr. Karuna Thompson. Dr. Thompson was the first minority faith chaplain hired by the Oregon Department of Corrections in 2001. Her work as a chaplain has focused on developing a diverse program of faith-based services at Oregon State Penitentiary. She was raised in the, oh, Karuna, I might mispronounce this, in the Shambhala Buddhist community in Boulder, Colorado, which inspired her interest and work in the field of social justice, in particular, restorative justice. As a prison chaplain, she works with the community to develop and promote spiritual care of incarcerated people and promotes peacemaking projects in the prison community. She is a founding member and coordinator for the Victim Offender Dialogue Program offered by ODOC, as well as the Northwest Justice Forum, which promotes restorative justice practices in Oregon and Washington. Dr. Thompson began her undergraduate studies in criminal justice at Northeastern University and completed her undergraduate work in religious studies at Naropa University. This was followed by a master's in engaged Buddhism, also at Naropa University, where she interned with Tom Cavanaugh, a leader in restorative justice practices in Colorado. She completed her doctorate in Buddhology at the University of the West with a dissertation proposing a Buddhist vision and framework for crime, justice, and society. She continues to work full-time at the prison, as well as teaching at Western Oregon University and Claremont School of Theology as adjunct faculty. In 2016, her work was also featured in the movie Chaplains, directed by Martin Doblmeier. Please join me, although virtually, in welcoming Dr. Karuna Thompson. Karuna, I will turn it over to you now.
Well, good evening, everyone. I hope that you are well and got to get out and enjoy some of this incredibly beautiful day. I got to spend some of my afternoon in our healing garden that was spoken of earlier in the introduction. And I was there with a man named Randy, who at the age of 18 was put on death row. And he had spent 33 years in, essentially death row was a separated housing unit in which they got 1 hour out of their cell each day. So he was locked down for about 23 hours a day until just very recently. Several months ago, the Oregon Department of Corrections decided to integrate all of the death row inmates into our general population. And he has now become one of the managers of our healing garden. And he received a group of us this afternoon and let us feed the koi fish. And the koi fish are ginormous. First of all, they have not been underfed, I assure you that. But they will come right up and suck the food out of your hands. So I hope that you had an equally delightful afternoon. And if not, I hope that the rest of your evening proves to be so. I am delighted to be here with you guys this evening. And I'm sure that there are many other much more qualified people, but I will do my level best to help kick off this extraordinary endeavor that the Western Oregon University folks have put together. I believe it was, I want to say it was about 3 years ago that Vivian and I sat down for the first time together and had just one of the most inspiring conversations I have had in the criminal justice field in a very long time. And it was so warm and so welcoming. And she expressed such interest in creating a community of thinkers nationally and internationally who are invested in these ideals and who are interested in not just the statement of them, but really deeply the practice and how to cultivate the practice, and then how to validate those practices. Because as we know, research drives much of the programming that is available in corrections and in our world. And without the evidence of it, it remains anecdotal. And as long as we are just a nice story, then we don't get the traction that we hope to get with our restorative justice work. So I thank Vivian for her vision and excitement, and Taryn has done an incredible amount of legwork to bring this vision to fruition much more quickly than any of us expected. We were figuring 3 or 5 years, and it came together, I think, in under 2 years, which is somewhat unheard of, but also speaks to the times that we're in and the importance of the work that we're doing. And so just a huge nod to this community for putting this together and creating a space in which this work can grow and thrive and develop and be refined, because it's so easy to get intoxicated with a good idea, but is it really a good idea? I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I'll share a little bit of some work that Tom shared with a class of mine recently. So I'm going to spare you guys having to look at me all evening, and I am going to hopefully share my screen and play this slideshow with some beautiful images for you. So I am starting this evening with a door, and this will be a discussion of doors and entryways and pathways. I began my work in restorative justice, I think it's 25 years ago now, in Colorado with Tom Cavanaugh, who was mentioned in my introduction. And he was one of the very early pioneers of real restorative justice, kind of applied restorative justice in Colorado, and took one of the first victim offender dialogue opportunities. You can research it online. It was a paintball incident where a young man, a child, was hit in the eye and lost the use of his eye with teenagers who were driving by shooting folks with paintballs. And that began a whole journey for him. And he is now living in New Zealand, working in the schools there, integrating the Maori practices of restorative justice. And he himself was a Catholic worker and very much driven by that sense of community service and outreach and obligation that we have to care for all of those around us. And his advice to me in beginning my work, because as we know, sometimes restorative justice can have a lukewarm at best reception in more conservative correctional and policing areas, and even community intervention areas, and certainly victim services. He cautioned me that you only go through open doors. Don't spend your time banging on closed doors. That will get you nowhere. Begin with the open doors. So I wanted to begin with at least the thought of that sense of we're going through entryways. We are going through liminal spaces to create something new and different together. And I just loved the image of this old doorway inviting us in. So I'd like to invite you into this further conversation about what this work is and what it might be and what it is inspired by. And I think we have to stop and recognize that this week was the 1-year anniversary of the death of George Floyd. And as much as I would like to believe that this was a singular event in my life, as I reflected and as I've been reading and just going back through all the literature, in my own lifetime, there have been multiple occurrences of this and multiple occurrences of this level of violence, this level of loss, this level of community outrage. And it raises the question of what do we do? And here are some images of Emmett Till, this beautiful young man who was lynched and then left his body to bloat in the river, and that his mother had the bravery to show his body and to show what had happened. And it is some of the first kind of media imagery that rocked the nation around this kind of violence and this level of social justice issue. And then as I was reflecting back in my teenage years, there was Rodney King, who we watched. It was the first video of a police beating, and it tore up LA, much as George Floyd's death has torn up our country with grief and rage and the unfairness of it. And perhaps maybe more importantly, the piece that it brings up here is the shame. When we look at Rodney King's body after this beating, this man who went through this experience in a traffic stop, it brings up shame. And I think it's a cultural shame that we don't know how to stop this. We don't know how to intervene. And that, as we know, shame can become toxic and is one of the primary drivers of violence. And when a culture is ashamed, then we get stuck in the same cycle. And I wanted to kind of take us back to an Australian thinker, Braithwaite, who was one of the early restorative justice folks in Australia. And he presented an idea that I just ran across recently again, and that rang bells from a lifetime ago, of reintegrative shame versus stigmatizing shame. And when we talk about reintegrative shame, we're talking about giving people a pathway back to relationship. Shame only occurs in so much as we are attached or connected to what is happening. And it happens in direct correlation to the level of attachment. And whether we mean to be or not, we are deeply connected to all other human beings. And when we see somebody else suffer, we feel it in our bones. I mean, we literally have mirror neurons that pick up what's happening, and we can feel what is happening for somebody else. And when we feel we have no way to make that right, then that can become crippling. That can become either we implode or we explode. And so we see these cycles of pain. However, what Braithwaite talks about is this idea of reintegrative shaming, where we give people a pathway back to redemption, a pathway back to being whole and part of the community. And as I was preparing for this presentation over the weekend, of course, there were all of the articles coming out about this anniversary. And there was a kind of wonderful article about mourning in the New York Times. And it was by David McIver. And I don't usually read quotes or do this, but this felt so on the spot and so directly relational to what we are going through that I wanted to take the time to share it tonight. And it was in his article entitled May 25th should be a day of mourning for George Floyd. And in this article, he discusses the significance and the transformative quality of mourning. And so I wanted to use his words because they are so good that I didn't think I could state it better. Mourning is a movement towards wholeness by way of acknowledging brokenness. Public mourning, then, is the expression of grief when the longing for social recognition and equal justice is unrequited. And I think that is so much what we have been feeling as a culture and a nation, and really in the world, this unrequited longing for equal justice, that somehow we need to find and build a pathway where that opportunity feels accessible and real for everyone, not the few, not the elite, but for everyone. And this mourning process we're in is actually almost a gestational place where we can birth that. He goes on to say, but public mourning can also manifest something different, precisely because it can open up a dreamlike space of possibility. This is what the psychoanalyst Dr. D.W. Winnicott called potential space. For Dr. Winnicott, cultural activities like a protest, although he did not use that example, are both real and surreal. They take place in the realm of shared reality, but they are not reducible to this reality because they are also imbued with aspects of dreaming, such as free association, playful juxtaposition, and a fluid sense of time. It is the dreamlike nature of cultural life that makes creativity possible, what Dr. Winnicott linked to play. Following Dr. Winnicott, we can see mourning as a space where we acknowledge loss and ambivalence by playing with the possibilities for different, more creative responses to loss. And what I would pose to you is this center and the possibilities that it is bringing to us is that invitation to play, is the possibility that something could open up so much bigger and so different than anything that we have thought of, that it even breaks our idea of what restorative justice is. So a week or two ago, maybe a month ago now, I was driving down a street in Eugene. I was going to visit a friend, and I was, you drive through and you read all the different signs as you go by. And there was this incredible sign that actually stopped my mind. And it was Black Joy Matters. And it completely reframed the conversation for me, that we aren't just talking about lives, we're talking about the celebration of each human being. What feels like a lifetime ago, I was in a course with Vincent Harding, who was one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speechwriters. And he was talking about diversity, and he was talking about the importance of celebrating each person. And he was talking about his experience as a Black man, and that he didn't want me just to see a Black man when I looked at him. He wanted me to see what color he was. He wanted me to see if he was a honey gold or a molasses purple, or if he was a midnight blue. He wanted to invite me to really look and see who this person across from me was, not just a Black man. But I think that this sign spoke to that, of that sense of how can we look further and not just see that this is just a human being. You know, if you watch the show Community, they have a mascot that's just this conglomerated thing that's, you know, this ultra sensitive human being as their mascot. And it's, you know, and it plays to that way in which this can completely wash out. Our sensitivities can almost miss the importance of seeing the details and the nuance of who each person is. And I think the sign and the work that we're doing at this center invites that particularism. In the Tibetan Buddhist justice system, there's this idea of radical particularism, that no situation like this has ever been before, nor will it ever be again. And that flies completely in the face of this whole idea of precedence, right? That there have been, you know, the precedent setting cases that if anything is like this, then it plays like this. Well, in this system, everything is completely unique and fresh and must be addressed as it is in this moment, because it will never be just this again. And if we were to imagine a legal system that included that, what would that be? Might that have joy at its center? So here is a different doorway, transitioning from joy to our prison. And this is where I spend most of my days. It is a 150-year-old prison. This is the photograph from that celebration. And in that time, it was in gathering photos for today, I got to go back through a bunch of different photos. And in that time, in that 150 years, the structure of this facility has changed very little. And the languaging around the different structures has changed very little. And so it was interesting to kind of note that, which was why I chose this kind of anniversary, that we've been doing this for a long, long time. And in, 400 years ago, when we started designing these prisons, I believe it was Howard, I can't remember his first name right now, and in England, who did a survey of all of the prisons and made the initial recommendations that Bentham then went on to design the penitentiary from. But this was 400 years ago. It's time. We can rethink this. And it doesn't have to mean discarding the people who are doing this good work. There are incredible human beings here really trying to work for the benefit of others. But the structure itself, the physical surrounding itself, really limits how that can be and what that can look like. I wanted to share with you and celebrate a little bit. This is the group of people who have gone to Norway and who are really working to bring back more of that system that really asks the question, how do we make good neighbors? How do we cultivate good community members that we want to share back to the community, that we can show that we are helping to make good human beings? And so this project and this effort has really taken root in our facility and is kind of being titled the Oregon Way. And so inside of this concrete structure that one of our community members has titled a concrete tomb, there are also spaces of healing and spaces of opportunity. And in this photograph, you will see another door, and this is the doorway into the healing garden that was came out of some of the restorative justice initiatives that we have here at Oregon State Penitentiary. And you'll see Dr. Melissa Michaud, who is at Willamette University and does a wonderful restorative justice course here in the institution. And Johnny Coffer is there, and he and, I'm going to forget the other gentleman's name. I was just with him this afternoon, but they were kind of the ones who were inspired by the restorative justice classes, also offered by Nathleen Frenner, to do something real in terms of making amends, doing something meaningful with how their lives run and what is possible. And out of that dreaming, and Johnny was talking about it this afternoon, that when this idea was born, he was in a really dark place and he was incredibly depressed and having an incredibly hard time. And it was in that place of grief, in that place of pain, that the spark of this idea came forward. And now we have this exquisite garden. This, I think they ended up, it was like a $300,000 project that the men raised all of the money for, and that has been a complete blessing to the community here. We have mental health clients who are able to go out there now. We have people who are in our behavioral health units who are able to go out there now. And the behavioral health units are people who may or may not have mental health issues, but who just have chronically difficult behavior challenges and are just hard to manage in general population. And so for them to get to go and sit in these places is extraordinary. And Randy was sharing with me about one of the projects that they're working on today, which is they're making a video of the garden, a video tour. And the purpose of that is that for many of the people who have spent a long time in their cells, they get quite a bit of agoraphobia, and it can become very scary for them to even come out at all. And so what they're wanting to do is to be able to show people with that kind of anxiety the tour, the video tour of this garden, and then be able to ask them and invite them out to the garden and begin to give them the experience of being in space and larger space that is safe. And so this is one of the seeds of restorative practices here at Oregon State Penitentiary. So I wanted to share with you a piece from my research that I was actually kind of surprised to stumble across, but it has become kind of the anchor for the work that I do in the prison and really in my life. And it was from Nagarjuna, who was and I apologize for going to religious literature, but this is what I have and this is where I'm from. So please excuse me. But Nagarjuna was an Indian saint who, from the Buddhist tradition, who was particularly famed for his understanding of emptiness. And there is a text that he wrote and that was translated of his advice to kings for how to rule, because a prince or a king had contacted him asking him for advice. So this was his advice. And from that, he very specifically, and this is now 2,000 years old, gives advice about how to care for prisoners. Care for prisoners. Criminals are to be treated like one's own children with a compassionate wish to reform them. And this is not necessarily the translation that I wanted. It was the one I could find today. But in one of the translations, it is so beautifully put that the king is to take the offender in as if he were his own precious child, only child, and then re-educate from there. Just as deficient children are punished out of a wish to make them competent, so punishment should be carried out with compassion, not through hatred or desire for wealth. Even when ministers have jailed criminals, the ruler should be concerned for them. Those who have committed particularly awful crimes are to be treated with special compassion. Weaker prisoners are to be released after brief incarcerations, and all others eventually. And while incarcerated, they should be kept in good condition. If upon analysis, some prisoners are determined to be particularly dangerous, they should be exiled. And as I thought about this text, the reality for us is that most of our prisoners are experiencing the worst of what was possible. They have been exiled. Our prisons do not create a way to be part of community in the way that this might vision. And so I ask you again, in that pain, when we feel that hurt, when we notice that that feels wrong, then how can we take that pain and generate something different? How can we do something new? And the truth is that we can. Human beings are unendingly creative. And recently in 2019, Danielle Sered, who runs Common Justice in New York City, released a book that if you have not read, I will show you my beaten up copy, Until We Reckon. It is a must read. But she talks about this community intervention and a court diversion program for violent offenses. And she really takes on, can restorative justice be used with violent offenders? Is this, I mean, we think about it for juveniles and we think about it in not so serious cases of maybe property crime, but can this be used with violent offenders? And what she posits is not only can it be used with violent offenders, but it is a much more effective intervention. And there are kind of 5 basic principles that they use in her Center of Common Justice for working through a process of restoration. And the first is the offender must acknowledge responsibility. And that can take some time because the acknowledgement is kind of 2-part. First, I did this, but then the second is a deep listening to understand the full scope of the harm. And that can be really painful. And that can take real time to get the depth and scope and understanding. I was listening to a gentleman today talk about he was sentenced at 16 years old, and it wasn't until he was 27 that he really got what he had done in the taking of this life and the grief that that caused him, of understanding the scope of harm that he had had in his life. And from that place of understanding the real scope, then genuine remorse can be expressed. And that becomes the catalyst for redemption, right? Because when we give people the dignity of understanding the impact of their actions and then the opportunity to make them right, then we are giving that bridge to make whole that Winnicott and the author of the New York Times article we're talking about. We're talking about grief as a process of making whole again, of reconciling what has been lost and what has changed. And while we can't go back and restore it, which is why oftentimes I prefer the language of transformative justice, we can integrate, we can make meaningful what has happened rather than simply pass over it. And that is the process of actually doing sorry and making things as right as possible, guided where possible by the survivor. And this is a really critical piece that is so often lost from our system right now, is that survivor's voice, is that person who may have lost everything, may have lost the dearest person in their life, and yet their voice ends at a victim impact statement. They don't get to influence at all what happens, of what comes. And so to include them through the whole process is a completely different dreaming. And it's a dreaming that we are capable, and it is a dreaming that is happening in programs like Common Justice. And then finally, no longer committing similar harm, right? When we have a child who has done something wrong, we sit them down, we help them to understand what has happened, the impact of it, the importance of doing something different, behaving differently. And then the commitment and the understanding and the recognition of real impact is that they no longer do the same thing. They no longer behave the same way. So I want to share with you some of our community here in the prison. And certainly part of this process of any restorative piece is the community. And again, going back to that first meeting with Vivian, this idea of creating a community that can honestly appraise the harms that have happened and can speak candidly about regret and give rise to new possibilities of how to serve and how to redeem oneself, and ultimately how to create a better society for us all to be in. So these are all men who have been working with our restorative justice program for, I think, many years now. A couple of them may be newer, But, and this is this gentleman in Melissa's class, because we were, before COVID started, we were in the process of making a film, a documentary film about this transformative justice process that the men have been working on now for about 8 years, of peacemaking inside the facility and mentoring one another in desistance activities so that the quality of their lives in this facility can be better. And so that when they go out to the community, they aren't just no longer a threat, but they are an asset. And so here you can see some of the film crew going through, and you see Melissa's little face peeking out. And I chose these photographs because they are smiling. You see everybody laughing, and there's a sense of playfulness and a sense of openness and possibility. And this is all happening inside of that concrete tomb, that fixed place that feels so unworkable at times. And yet here are human beings making something very different happen. And this is Cameron, one of our facilitators with students. And these are classes that are mixed, inside students and outside students from Willamette University. And we have other university classes called Inside Out that are formerly Inside Out program that come in and mix. It's mixing community. And this was what Tom O'Connor is talking about in terms of that healing and that holistic work that we were hoping to create in our facilities. And finally, here is another kind of door. It is a cell door, but it is an open cell door in which my hope is every inmate gets to walk out of and never have to walk back into. And as you can see, a prison cell is a little bit like living in a relatively small bathroom with a bed. And I think that we as a society can do better than that. But this door opens to Arnaldo Ruiz, who is one of our advisory members, but he was also one of the founding members of the restorative justice work here in our prison. And he inspired many to begin to think about how what we think and do creates what happens. And his willingness to step away from gang culture as a leader in those communities has created a ripple effect throughout the whole prison. And he is now working for Multnomah County as the Youth Empowerment and Violence Prevention Program Manager at Latino Network. He oversees the ALBA Collaborative, Youth Homeless Padrinos Mentorship for youth who have been impacted by violence and criminal justice system and gang impacted. Furore Setter, I think I blew that, but which is the foster care youth who are in DHS, custody, foster homes, and protector home or facilities. So I joked with him earlier that perhaps really his better title is just God, and I apologize to anybody who that offends, but the burden that he's carrying as one person is clearly too much. But what he brings forward is the importance of credible witnesses. And we need credible witnesses at the beginning of our processes when we're talking about community action and community policing. And we need plainclothes officers walking in the communities who have de-escalation skills. We need people like Cahoots, who are mental health specialists, and nursing folks who are coming to non-emergency situations or to mental health situations, avoiding police officers having to put their lives at risk for situations for which they're not necessarily trained to care for. And I know that we may have some police attending this evening, and my hope is that these community-based responses make your job safer, make you feel like you are going to go home every night and that is not a worry. And I think that these community-based interventions give us a real shot at that and give us a way of honoring and respecting what you have done for our communities and how you do it, because you're an essential part of our team. And of course, all of the work that we're doing in corrections, and then Arnaldo going home and being able to be an asset. And how do we create that? How do we create that bridge where not just one person is coming out, and the Trevor Walravens and the Joshes and these people who come out and they are just radiant beings. And how do we create that, not as the anecdotal, but as the norm? These are the people that we want coming back to our communities, back to our homes. And how do we document or validate that this is what's happening? And here enters WRJRC at Western Oregon University. This is really critical work that we need to document, and we need to look critically at, and we need to be able to answer the questions and the critiques that people raise about restorative justice and about it being too soft, or about it not being able to work with extreme crime, or about it being a good idea, but it's not applicable in some way. It's really important. And I'd like to share kind of an anecdotal thing. Tom O'Connor, of course, was the first person brave enough to hire me in the field of corrections, bless his heart, but has also remained a friend and mentor for a long time. And he came to my class recently and shared an exercise. It was a thinking exercise. And what I walked away from this exercise, it was a math exercise, which just makes me panic anyway, but it was really the question of fast thinking. And sometimes we really think that we're doing the right thing, but we don't stop and ask the question, is this really what it is? Am I perceiving accurately? And he has 5 wonderful questions that he has developed, and that I hope over time in these research processes he shares with you, but they have kind of stayed with me. And the first is kind of, you just have the direct experience, but then kind of, what is it? Is that really what it is? Is it good? And is it loving? And when we ask these questions of what we're doing, it helps us to slow down and examine and be able to answer our naysayers and those who would maybe challenge this approach. And this is where the Restorative Research Center becomes critical, is that we can then provide people the information that says, no, this is what works. And, oh, we did this and it didn't work and it wasn't great. And so we're going to modify it and do this. And that is my hope for this center, is that it both creates a resource for our communities and nation and maybe the world, and it also allows us to apply some critical thought to the work that we are doing. So with that, I will close with an open door, inviting us to find all of the open doors in our lives and wide open spaces. And I think that's everything I have for you this evening, and I am available for questions or further discussion. And I think Taryn as well, she can maybe be more of the specialist in the particulars of the center. And we can just have a discussion. I think it has to be, you have to put the questions in the Q&A because we don't see you or in the chat.
Thank you, Karuna, for your presentation and for your wise words and your compassion and delivery. We do have some questions coming in, and I would encourage you again to post your questions, as Karuna said, to the Q&A. You could also post into the chat. If somebody does want to speak, I figured out that if you raise your hand, I think I can allow you to talk. So if you want to try that, we can experiment with technology and see if we can work that out. But in the meantime, before I get to the questions that are posted in the chat here, I just want to touch on some things that you said at the very end there. You were talking about the importance of this research and how we can use this research to encourage change. Earlier, you had said that very little has changed at OSP in particular in the last 150 years, yet you still have hope for change now. And I'm wondering, because we are working in a system that works to preserve itself, how is the research that we can do at the center, how can that have a real impact on current corrections practices, in your opinion?
Man, this question comes and it's a hard one. And I would like to give a nod to Professor Michaud at Willamette University, who has the Transformative Justice Initiative that is really looking to, particularly for reentry work, how do we give this teeth? How do we root this in real-time practices? And I think, and maybe I hope that at some point Tom could speak to this a little bit because he's really geared in the research world. But I think that we have to go back and push the evidence-based practices model, that there is a tremendous amount of research about special housing and different things, and that comes out of academia, but we do have to find a bridge. And I think that that can be one of the challenges of this resource center, is creating that bridge to institutions and organizations. And again, that comes with this idea of credible messengers. So we need police officers who are interested in restorative practices. We need correctional professionals who are interested. And we begin to carve out these niches that ultimately then almost become kind of contagious and similar to, Nathleen's class, where this idea came up. And then several years later, we have a healing garden in the middle of a maximum security prison. Like, how does that happen? And it happens because there were credible messengers working in every direction, right? We had the prisoners who were advocating for a better environment for themselves. We had community members who were advocating and assisting with raising funds. We had correctional staff who were interested and willing to support it. And we had artists and specialists who came in and donated their time. So I think that it's really about working collaboratively and working in a way that is not siloed. So often in this work, we get really stuck in our little corner. And the more that we can expand, the more that we can open to collaborative work, the better chance we have of making it real.
Thank you. You and I both have both used the term credible messenger this evening. Can you put a definition to that?
So yeah, it's a term that's circulating more and more, and certainly Sared used it in her book, but it really is, it's about having the right person talking to the right people. And a good model of this is in the Ojibwe communities and the work that they're doing with sexual offenders. And the way that they are doing the interventions is that while they do have a professional who comes and makes contact with somebody who's been accused, they always have somebody who's gone through the treatment program with them, who is somebody who has been a sex offender, who has committed these crimes, who has gone through treatment, and who can speak and understand the mind of the person that they're encountering. And I think that that is the same. I, as a chaplain, am not the right person to maybe go and speak to a very conservative police department. However, a police sergeant who has had some experiences with restorative justice and the effectiveness of de-escalation practices or diversionary practices or diversionary policing is the right person to go to talk to them, because they can speak the same language. It's very much about language and connectivity. So credible messengers are the right person speaking to the right person with the same history and background and language.
Thank you, that is very helpful. Let's turn now to some of the questions that are posted in the Q&A, and I believe you can see those too, hopefully. Let's start with Lauren Kessler's question. And Lauren, thank you for being here tonight. Could you talk about the very porous divide between victim and perpetrator and how this might fit into transformative justice thinking and action?
This is a really painful one. We just spent the afternoon talking about this split, and it is entrenched in our system is this understanding that once an offense happens, the victim and offender should have no further contact. And the intention of that, of course, is that the offender can have no opportunity to do further harm. However, what we don't see, oh, somebody says we cannot see the questions. It says only panelists can. I would be interested in seeing the questions. I don't know if we can.
I don't know that we can fix that. We will read them aloud for you though.
So to further speak to this, and it goes back to credible witnesses, actually, or credible messengers, that what we have not had is people in the victim services and victims themselves who are willing to come forward and advocate for something different. And who, because it's really only that voice that can change this. You can't have an offender saying, oh, I really, you know, and that's what happens right now, right? We have offenders who are completely ready and willing to do whatever they can to be helpful, but we have a victim culture that is paternalistic and wants to protect everybody from any possible harm, which we know is impossible. But that voice really has to be driven by credible messengers from the victim community.
What does it look like to keep the survivor or the victim involved if that's what they want, and to give them more of a voice?
Well, I think, you know, SORED's program does that from beginning to end, right? They, instead of just a victim statement, the victim gets to be informed about the different processes. They get to be involved in the decision-making about what the consequences for the offender's actions are. They can do that either from a distance through a facilitator, or they can be directly involved in the room while those decisions are being made. They can send a representative to hold that spot for them and speak for their interests. There are a lot of ways that it can happen. And there can even be, you know, if that victim really wants no involvement, there can be surrogate victims who have had similar experiences who can speak to that kind of crime and what they would like to see. So, you know, again, this is just about broadening the scope of our thinking. And the truth is that most violent incidences aren't stranger incidences, and they happen either within communities where people know each other or within families. And, you know, the one caveat that I would make to some of this is that domestic violence is a really delicate area that I'm not sure how we can work restoratively with. I know that there are people who are wading into that, but it is an area that I would not feel capable stepping into. So I will just recognize that.
Yes, I do know there is research in that area, specifically folks who focus on intimate partner violence, and they're looking at how to bring restorative justice practices into that realm because they are experts in that area. I also am not an expert in that area and don't want to speak to that, but we can recognize that it does exist. That
it does. Yeah.
Melissa Michaud, thank you for being here, Melissa. She said, Karuna, what role do you think your Buddhist teaching plays in your work?
Well, hi, Melissa. It's nice to hear your voice. Well, I would say that, in fact, you know, from my perspective, the restorative justice work I do is my ministry. Like, that is, Buddhism is not a evangelical tradition. We don't go out and kind of pursue membership. So for us, it's about how you live. And for me, that is about how do we cultivate meaningful human relationships that are wakeful and that invite people's intelligence and their natural innate ability to be kind and to be clear and intelligent. Everybody has that from a Buddhist perspective. So for me, the two are not separate. I may not use particularly Buddhist language or kind of jargon, but it is the activity of doing this work itself that is, for me, faith-based.
All right, let's Change tracks here just a little bit and look at Greg's question. Greg Williford, glad to have you here tonight, Greg. What are we doing to educate police in the principles of both procedural justice and restorative justice, and the value in having those practices embedded within community policing and the culture of the organization? That I'm not sure police culture makes the necessary connection between procedural justice, restorative justice, and the current trend of training on de-escalation and becoming more effective in responding to the mentally ill or homeless.
This is a really good question. And the truth is, I don't think that we're doing enough. And I'm embarrassed to say that I have relatively little knowledge of this. But what I will offer is that I feel like the trainings that we are offering may be a little bit misguided, because what we're asking the police force to do is take on more. And what I'm hoping to see is more collaboration like what we have in Cahoots, where there are mental health specialists who are called if it's a mental health crisis, where there are non-emergency medical specialists who can respond to non-emergent medical issues that ride with those mental health professionals. So what I would like to see and what I would advocate for is police actually being called on less, because that puts you, and particularly in situations with mental illness and these things, and what I would advocate for is that you guys get additional support, community-based support, that takes you out of harm's way in situations that do not, that aren't your specialty. And it's no criticism to what police do. In fact, I think the police do a very good job at what we have asked them to do. But we need to provide better supports. And as a community, we need to be, again, providing the credible messengers who can work with police forces to create those partnerships. And again, I think police often get so isolated, and all of the things in criminal justice, we get so siloed that that those partnerships don't get created easily, because it's experienced as critique rather than support. And I think the main thing that we always need to do is to approach with a sense of appreciation for the hard work people are doing. And then how can we collaborate and make this easier and better for you?
I like how you said approach with appreciation and coming from this strengths-based perspective rather than any defensive stance. Wendy Kincaid has raised her hand. And so Wendy, we are going to try this out. I'm going to click allow to talk and we'll see what happens. Okay, Wendy, you should be able to unmute now and turn your video on if you like, and you can ask a question.
So I actually didn't realize that I had raised my hand. But hi, Karuna. It's good to see you. Good to hear all your great words. And Karen, I don't think I've met you, but anyway, I don't really have a question other than just how can I get involved? How can RJ practitioners get involved? I guess, but it's probably too early for that question.
It's a great question, Wendy, and thank you so much. It is the question that everybody should be asking, or well, okay, that was an overstatement, or that was a push on my part of everybody should be asking how to get involved and everybody should be asking how to help. All right, that's too much. I recognize that, but I love that you asked that. There are so many different ways that people can get involved, and Karuna, I'm sure you have a list. With regard to the Western Restorative Justice and Reentry Center, anybody who is interested in a research partnership with us can reach out to our website. I'll put the website in the chat. It's wou.edu, wou.edu/WRJRC. You can reach out to any of us and we would be happy to connect with you with any of the projects you are working on as appropriate. We'll have a conversation and see if there's anything we can do to partner. I know there are also a million other volunteer opportunities. And if you are on this call and you are with an organization that has volunteer opportunities, please post something in the chat for everyone to see as well. Karuna, what is your answer to that of how can people get involved?
Well, ditto on what Taryn said. And I think that that's part of the excitement about this center is this idea that we can become that think tank, we can become that community that generates new possibilities, that generates new ways of doing things. And, you know, of course, here in the prison, we always want volunteers and we always, but the real place that we need to be doing work is in that community outreach and is in developing those resources for the police officers so that they have somebody they can turn to and they can call and they can get the assistance that they need. I mean, this is where the hot button in our community is right now. And rather than alienate the police from where we are and what we're doing, we want to make the friendship and we want to find out, how can we support you? What is hard about your work? What do you feel unsafe doing? And how can we make that better?
How can this happen in real time? You've talked a bit about how law enforcement can be involved. Can you share maybe some of the ideas that you all have, that you and the community of guys you're working with on the inside have come up with, of ways to interrupt violence and interrupt harm while it's happening?
Well, I mean, the men in here do it. I mean, that's, they as community members, violence is something that is familiar to them. It's been a go-to for some of them. And so, not that they're not afraid of it, but they are willing to step in between. And largely, and it's really that language of interrupting, like they're able to disrupt whatever intensity is happening and get enough space for people long enough that something different can happen. And so really, again, you know, and this is why people like Arnaldo and others are so important, is that they are able to do that work real time in the community, stepping in and interrupting those conflicts that are deeply personal, deeply impassioned, that, you know, lead to the police shoot, or not the police shootings, but the shootings that we're having in Portland and the escalated crime, because it's about these deep emotional passions. And if you haven't watched it, it's worth watching, which is the Frontline special on the interrupters. It was a project done in Chicago where gang members who had been incarcerated and desisted, but who still had good reputations in the community, were able to go in and do the real-time work. When something was happening on the street corner, they stepped in, removed the parties from one another in a way that the police can't do. You know, these are, and so it is a process of creating and taking a leap of faith and trust that we can trust one another as community members, that not everybody's trying to get over on us, which is very hard for those of us in the correctional professions and the policing professions, because we're trained to be suspicious of everyone and everything. But we need to be able to create those partnerships. And really, you know, that is where the groundswell needs to happen right now. And that's the work that we've been doing inside the prison. And, you know, have prevented, though we can't document, many disturbances. And we were able to make it through all of this last year without a single major blow up in our facility, which, you know, given the fire evacuations, given the COVID, given the racial tensions, like that was an extraordinary thing. And that had to do with administration, working with staff, that had to do with the incarcerated population, working with one another, and really negotiating back and forth with one another, but really talking. And again, I think we underestimate how much just taking the time to communicate helps.
Excellent, thank you. Let's continue with talking about what's happening inside the prison with Corey's question. Corey, thank you for being here this evening. The healing garden seems to be a beautiful element of the prison. What experiences of self-expression and art practices are available to the incarcerated population? And do you see any place for art practices in the process of self-knowledge required for the steps of understanding impact of their actions and possibly understanding a new way of being in the community? Beautiful question.
Absolutely. And I wish Melissa were here to be able to speak to this too, but one of the pieces that we have incorporated into all of our restorative justice work is not only the learning and the collaborative work with the community, but always we have some artistic expression at the end of or as part of what we're doing. Because again, when we're working with this energy, when we're working with this sadness, when we're working with this grief, it is kind of a dreamy liminal state. And it is what gives birth to creativity and possibility. And so we have to integrate that. And I think that it is really part of how we weave a new fabric. And it's so, yeah, I think it's a critical piece of the work that we do.
Kira Duffy, thank you for your question, Kira. Thank you for being here. She asked, do you hope that small reform policies and new programs can create radical change within the CJ system?
Can you read that one more time? I'm not seeing that one.
This one is in the chat.
Okay.
That small reform policies and new programs can create radical change within the criminal justice system. I like how you worded your question, Kira, that small changes lead to radical change. It's an
I go back and forth about this one a lot. And we have a lot of debates about this one. And I think for a long time I was a proponent that, you know, small changes can do, you know, make big changes over time. And 20 years into this, I think I feel more like radical change has to be radical change. And at some point we have to make a leap. And it's scary and it breaks with what we know. But if we are going to stop the cycle, then we have to think and do something differently.
Which makes coalitions like what we have been creating even more important.
Yeah.
Many of us from so many areas, different areas can come together and work together for radical change.
Yeah.
Scott Smith, glad to have you here, Scott, from our advisory board. He said the us who do direct service also need to get more fluent in expressing the full value of restorative programming. What are some measures you'd like to see better represented in research around responses to criminal harms beyond simply impact on recidivism and impact on public budget? Oh gosh, which is what it's like the measure that is always used, Scott. Measures that might get at the issue of healing, resilience.
I would like to see victim satisfaction studies. And I would like to see community satisfaction studies and community studies of community safety, experiences of community safety and well-being. And I think, you know, I mean, Bhutan is an interesting place. They have rather than their annual fiscal assessment, they have an annual happiness study where they actually just look at how well is their society feeling rather than how economically solvent are they. And I think that we can begin to ask those larger questions. Again, Black joy matters. Like, that's a different framing. And I think that, again, we are being asked to frame the questions differently. I don't think that we need to stay inside the current boundaries. And it's hard. It's hard because, you know, we have those grooves and that's where we go to and that's our go-to. But I think, again, like one of the first pieces would be to include the victim voice. Like, how satisfied were you with this experience? And I'll tell you almost one, most victims I've spoken to didn't get what they wanted out of what our system has offered them. And if that becomes the driver of the conversation, I think we get a different justice system.
I love that. I love that answer. When we look only at recidivism, we're missing so much of the picture. Recidivism is also not consistently defined. So if that means that someone is convicted of a new felony within 3 years of release, that misses all sorts of other things going on in someone's life. Have they gotten a job? Are their personal relationships intact? Did they get their kids back? What's their housing situation? Do they feel safe? Do they feel happy? And you can't measure all those things on quantitatively, and you can't measure all those things really on recidivism, which is what so many grants are based on, so many public policies are based on, and they're missing the big picture. I love that answer. As we talk about recidivism, we need to talk about reentry. What are some things that perhaps some restorative justice work that you've done inside the prison, or things that you've witnessed that you believe help the guys as they make that transition back to the community?
Well, this goes more towards really kind of the work that Melissa is starting to work towards, and the work that Tom O'Connor and the team of us did for a long time. We had created Home for Good in Oregon, which recognized, and what we know is that when people are connected to community, they are more successful. And when you think about housing, when you think about jobs, when you think about basic resources, most of those things we get through people we know. And so that social capital is something that we can help build. And it's one of the pieces where religious services and activities section and different places where community members can come in are important. And as important is that those same community members are able to continue working with people as they transition out into the community in a safe way. And of course, there's a lot of anxiety for the correctional system about liability. And if somebody gets perpetrated against or some further harm happens, then are we responsible for that if we knowingly let that connection continue? But in the Home for Good program, it was designed specifically for that, so that volunteers could get trained how to safely work with people in the communities, how to safely bring them to community events, how to involve them in work activities or volunteer activities that create a meaningful, purposeful connection. And hands down, we know that that is what prevents recidivism, is purposeful, meaningful lives. And we can do that. And again, it's based on something as simple as having a cup of coffee with somebody. A lifetime ago, another of my mentors, he was this great Jesuit priest. He was just crusty and grumpy, but he was the chaplain who was here when I was hired. And he talked about really the issue when people release is not whether they can get a job or a place to live, but what do they do between 5 o'clock and 11 o'clock every night. And when you are sitting alone with no place that wants you, that's a horrible place to be. And then the piece that nobody talks about, but that I see extensively in here, is that deep friendships are formed inside these facilities. These men attend to each other impeccably and make sure that they have what they need, and they can read one another's body language in a split second, and they can tell if they're coming off a bad phone call with their wife or their mother, or they'll notice if some guy isn't smelling right, and they'll make sure that he gets hygiene products. And yes, all of these things are maybe against the rules, but they are so attentive to one another and what is going on. And you can imagine you're living in a bathroom with another man surrounded by 1,000 other men, and everything and anything that one of those men do can affect your whole life for the next however long. So you have to be attuned that way. But the depth of caring that they have for one another is humbling. And so what we don't recognize is that when people release from prison, they are often saying goodbye to the closest and deepest friendships they have ever had. And they're going out to the community to nothing or very little. And that, when you have spent 10 years, 15 years, even 5 years, surrounded by hundreds of men all the time, or women, and a good portion of those people who you really care about and who really care about you, and you go out and then what is there for you to have? What is there? And so of course they come back, and it's like a reunion, and it's a celebration even at times, so my answer is if we can't create something that anchors people in the community meaningfully, then we will always have our recidivism issue.
I want to welcome anyone to submit additional questions. Whether or not they do, I'm going to say I'm going to wrap us up with this question unless another one is in. But what I want to ask you is, we talk a lot, especially those of us who, in the criminal justice field, who are familiar with restorative justice and transformative justice. We are very familiar with the ripple effects of harm. Can you talk about the ripple effects of healing?
That's a really good question. And I was kind of trying to speak to this earlier in a different setting, and I don't think it worked, but so one of the pieces of the work that I've done in here is helping to create and run a facilitated dialogue program. And in that process, one of the things that I found is that almost to a person that I worked with, and this could be very different for other facilitators, I don't know, but when a crime happens, it's almost like the lives of the victim and offender get like tied up together. And there's something that happens in that facilitated process. I mean, like literally, I worked with a man who was of a very unusual faith background and had very unusual hobbies. And the victim, who had not had contact with him for like 20 years, had the same faith, the same hobbies, I mean, like eerie, that kind of, and there's something that gets tied up together. And I don't know how to describe it or explain it, but at the moment that they get to actually talk and work through that, it gets released. And so their lives actually get to become their own again. And when somebody's life gets to become their own again, that touches their families, touches their friends, touches the institutions and organizations that they're a part of, touches their churches, and it can become contagious. I mean, that was the idea behind the model of the interrupters, was actually of crime as a contagious disease. And if we can interrupt it, if we can give a vaccine for it, then we can actually not only prevent the harm, but wholer communities can happen. So I think it is, you know, I mean, if I look back over the 20 years that I've spent in the prison, and this maybe goes back to the question of, you know, small reform practices. I mean, the first time I gave a presentation to the chaplains, who I thought would be a receptive group about restorative justice, I felt daggers through the whole conversation. So the fact that here we are 20 years later, having a conversation about how to expand and create a community of practitioners that further collaborates and validates this work is, you know, those are the ripple effects. And, you know, and this goes to the children of the incarcerated people. This goes to the spouses of incarcerated people. This goes to the children and spouses of victims. This goes, I mean, it just reverberates.
Thank you. I think that's a really good place for us to wrap up for the evening. I want to thank you so much, Karuna, for helping us launch this research center and for being a part of the center on the advisory board. I have really high hopes about the great work that we're all going to be doing. I see thank you messages coming in the Q&A, in the chat. You are spectacular. You know, I'm a big fan. So thank you very much for this. And thank you to all of you who attended tonight and helped us get started, get the center started on the right foot. As we discussed earlier, please reach out if you have any interest in research partnerships. If you have additional questions or want to continue the conversation, please reach out and we would be happy to talk with you more. But for this evening, we will go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you very much. And good night.
Thank you. Good night.